7, 8, 9, 10. This is Chad Barron. You're listening to My Alien Life.
My Alien Life Podcast.
Three, two, 1, 0, 0, and liftoff.
When I first started this, they said there was about 800,000. I think we're approaching 1 million podcasts and going strong right now.
Congratulations.
Yeah. I'm actually, I'm
nice.
part of that million. I'm actually, shooting myself in the foot by teaching a college class in podcasting, which starts next month. So, in the first day it was advertised. I think there was 5 that actually signed up. So I'm interested to see on how many. Of course, there's social distancing, so we can't have hundreds, but not that there's going to be hundreds in Montana. With a small population. You're in Colorado, right?
Yeah. So you're in Montana?
I'm in Montana. Yeah, we're in the same.
Oh,
we're in the same time zone.
Yeah. I had a dream that I end up in Montana when all this is done. In Dillon.
Have you been
Dillon?
Have you been to Dillon?
It's
a nice place.
I grew up in Idaho Falls, Pocatello.
Oh, yeah.
So that side of the state is home for me, even though I was born in Twin.
Right.
I graduated from high school in Idaho Falls. Mm-hmm. First, TV job was IF. So, anyway, it's a cool story. And I was telling this interview, I was doing exactly this. And she was like reading my bio. And I'm like, a lot has happened since then. I'm in Dillon now. So.
Yeah, Dillon, any place in Montana on west side of the Rockies is fantastic. And especially this time of the year. Wintertime, I'm not into it. I think you have a milder winter there.
Down here we do, but I'm up high. I'm at 8,000 feet, so that kind of negates some of the latitude south.
Yeah.
So,
but do you think now this is something topical, especially for my area, because I moved here. I've lived in this area for going on 30 years now, but when I moved here because I lived on the east slope of the Rockies in Montana, and the average day for wind was 45 miles per hour. Twice a week it was 70 miles per hour, and once a month they would top 100, on a regular basis, and that's no exaggeration.
We call that Chinook.
Yeah, and but the Chinook from the south, Scott, this is both directions, or I think it's every direction, but mostly from the north to the south. But
when it's at that speed,
yeah, and then
so what city now?
Kalispell area.
Oh, Kalispell. So you're up north.
Yeah. Okay. So, but so I moved here to get away from the wind, and so I went to the University of Montana. You went to Kansas State. You didn't go to school in Idaho, did you?
No,
because we would be rivals. But
I was out of there. I had just come out, and I wanted to be away from family.
Right.
So
I understand.
I'm just saying.
I didn't get that far, but I went to the University of Montana. But growing up, extremely windy. Moved over here, no wind, and I think it was about 2006, 2007. About so this is just a side story, and I could talk all day, and I'm not trying to talk over top of you, but somebody had a sailboard for sale, and I was interested in doing that. And I asked him, this guy was a surfer, and he moved from California. He moved here. Why are you giving this up? There's not enough wind. And I thought, there's not enough wind. I thought maybe it just required a little wind. And they said, no, it requires quite a bit of wind. So I passed on that, was enjoying the lack of wind. And then about 2007, we started getting morning winds, and now it's extreme. And this is no exaggeration. In the last 2 years, just on the west slope here where I live by Flathead Lake, there's been over 20,000 trees, huge trees lost. And so between September and I'm going to say mid-May, just these regular huge windstorms. And in the last year, there was about 20 of those. So question, is our global weather pattern seeing more stability or more extremes?
But both are true.
Well, I think that's right.
More stably unstable.
But it's changing so much here. I just don't know why that is. I mean, this is not a windy place, and it is windy all the time now.
And it is now.
Why?
It is now.
Why?
Because nature isn't in control of the weather. It's just not. There's another force that is there. It has held. How do I really want to explain this? Because we're playing with a resonance, and we can't feel it. We're just too small. We're kind of inside the wavelengths that are playing with the weather. So it has this ability to. The scientific term is cymatics, C-Y-M-A-T-I-C-S. So it's the science of sound, and at a certain frequency, you'll be able to see water dance on a table, say a pot of water or a tub of water, and you apply a resonance to it, and it'll resonate, it'll vibrate, it'll give a very clear vibratory signature on the top of the water. And then you add 2 or 3 or 4 different points of resonance, and you'll see patterns take shape. And you move the transmitters slowly or quickly, and that will impact the resonance of the top of the water. And it's what I've come to understand is that this is how they play with the weather. And even in looking at Hurricane Laura today, as it came ashore, rolled through Louisiana, and as it lost its eye, there was still this incredible movement of the lower layers of the cloud that we could see via satellite imagery. But yet clouds just above it were barely moving. So we have these very separate layers of the atmosphere that can be directly manipulated. And then there's this incredible shear or difference in speed from, say, the winds at 8,000 feet versus 12,000 feet. They could be going 180 degrees from each other. And then there's these cool wave-looking clouds that will denote that boundary between these two layers. And none of it is natural. And this is why, I don't know if we wanted to get into this as quickly, is the chemtrails. Is then you can see with these visible lines, these straight lines, where those separate boundaries exist. The atmosphere will take one part of a trail and move it all together in one direction, and then almost as if it was cut with a steak knife, cut, and then another part of the trail is moving off in a different direction. And what these trails do is reveal how the sky, how the atmosphere, how the weather is being played with. Sometimes it's constructive for rainfall, sometimes it's destructive. But there is no reason with this technology at play that we need to be dealing with life-threatening weather situations, why we need to be dealing with wholesale droughts. It has become a tool of war, and it has been that way for probably 2 human generations. These floods in China are not an accident. The drought in the western states, not an accident. These things are intentional, and they're all to bring about a specific playbook of outcomes. It's just that deliberate. So I could not stay inside the atmospheric sciences community. I couldn't stay on the air at the station I was in Idaho and know these things. With good intent and devotion to my audience, if you will, that I was standing there to give a good forecast at 5, 6, and 10 with the tools that I had. And let's just say there's a 7-8 inch snow coming, and the ski resorts get excited. The Department of Transportation preps for it. The system gears up to deal with a snowfall come wintertime. What happens if it doesn't show up? What happens if in the middle of the event you get this huge warming zone inside the middle of the storm, and then from below the clouds open up, plane or two comes through early in the morning, and then you can see stars, but yet still there's ice crystals coming out of the sky. So the whole thing has been what we would call in summertime iced over, where condensation just completely runaway crystallization. The water droplets could not continue to collect, to continue to grow the ice crystals, the snow crystal, to then pass this threshold where gravity would pull it out of the sky. They would just be blown apart into very, very small droplets. You'd get a little ice crystals coming out of the sky, and then the sky would get hazy, and then the cloud thinner and thinner and thinner, and then the event is over. Everybody wakes up expecting some fresh snow on the ground, and you've gotten it dusted. And I would have to come on the air and explain what happened. But knowing what happened, it's nothing wrong with the poor guys at the Weather Service, or even, at least in 2004 and 5 when I was on the air doing this, even more ignorant. And they're scratching their heads as to what happened. And then all they can do is describe what happened. They can't explain why it happened.
So you're saying that you were observing weather that defied your scientific background and expertise and education.
What I had to do was educate myself about a different aspect of science.
Sure, but previously, I mean, you had a background in science, and
yeah.
So what does that look like when you're in college and you're studying meteorology? What courses are you taking, and how much schooling does it take for you to get to where you were in, like, when you graduated and got your first 2 or 3 jobs?
I was fortunate that I had a mentor that during, what was I was 12 or 13 at the time. And one of the merit badges that I chose to do was weather. I'm a kid. I'm looking for easy merit badges. So I'm flipping through the Boy Scout handbook, and I come across astronomy, knocked that one out. I came to weather, and I read through the things that I had to do. I had to build a weather station. I had to keep a log. I had to, do forecasts. But one of the things was to watch the evening news for 30 days and log the forecast, log what happened, and in relationship to the home weather station that I built. So as that progressed, I fell in love with weather. And I'd always been a numbers geek anyway. I liked numbers, and I liked economics. I liked anything that played with numbers. It felt right to me. So by the time, this was, say, 1978, it was July 78 when I began my weather logbook. And once that was done, I got the badge, but then it came time for the Eagle Merit badge, that Eagle badge. And I had to do a public service kind of thing. And I thought, well, this is kind of cool. I like weather. What if I were to report my little town in eastern Idaho, to the TV station? So I called all 3 of them and offered my services. And one of the guys kind of took a liking to me at the NBC station, Channel 8 KIFI. And he said, Scott, I don't have room right now for your town, but come to the station, have your dad bring you in. I'll give you a tour, and we'll go from there. So within 3 weeks, my dad, my little brother, and we took a tour of the station. And at the very end, as we were leaving, he said, here's my number. If something unusual happens, give me a call. So 4 months later, it got to be April, and it was a warm afternoon, and I gave him a shout. I said, hey, Ken, 77 degrees, and it was 36 this morning. And I said, good, I've got room for you today. I'll type it in. So we typed in my little town, and that was it. So from the time I had just turned 13, he was my mentor. So by the time I got to college, there was very little operationally, weather-wise forecasting that I didn't already know. And he'd been able to kind of work a production assistant job for me for my senior year. So I moved out of home, much to tears of my mother, and in with he and his family. And I was, boom, on the ground running through my senior year of high school. So by the time I got to college, there was the math behind it. There was the calculus. There was the dynamics. There was that stuff. But when it came to actual forecasting, I knew more than all the guys there. And then that enabled me my sophomore year to get my first on-air job in Topeka. So the college is great, and I want to say it was a good thing, and I love the social aspect of it, the friends, all of that. But there are a lot of careers where college is a very expensive proposition to get in the door of where your talents and your skills lie. And even more so today with the way technology is, because I've never used calculus. I've never used fluid dynamics. You know, it's cool. It's a pain in the behind, but it isn't necessarily necessary. But so once I got to college, that's, the career started, almost congruently with it. And I enjoyed that. I really enjoyed that.
You're telling me you haven't used any calculus at all?
No, the computers do all that. All that is done.
Wow.
Let those guys who are good at it soak themselves with it.
Right.
Let them do that work. There's a place for everybody within the society. Everybody's got their skills, the places where they shine. And, the education system tries to push us all into this little box and send us out of the world with a degree, and we may not be well-versed in what our eventual job is. And so that was the gift that I had, was that mentor, Kentori. And at that station that he was able to walk me through, would go to town, because we lived a good distance from town. He'd drop me off, and, 3 hours later, Mom would pick me up after her errands were done, and we'd go home again. And I was another step closer to being on the air. Yeah,
that's cool. That's cool to be able to attribute, that sort of a life to somebody who would help you out in the way, because it's a real technical field. So if I was a TV weatherman, and let's say I was at a station, let's say I was in my 25th year as a TV weatherman, at a station that I'd been at for 10 years, how much of the math am I doing? How much of the science am I doing? Am I just getting the weather from somewhere else, like NOAA or somewhere else, or are they actually doing the work, and do they have the equipment and the ability to, and the time actually to figure out the weather for the news station, or are they getting it elsewhere?
Yeah, they're getting it elsewhere. But there's an aspect of wisdom, and this is the big key, is that we tend to forecast from our gut. What has worked in the past? What are the patterns we in now? What you see, and there's really just a gut aspect to it. And honestly, it's an art.
Well, that's an art. I'm going to just jump in, because I have a question, and the question is, what percentage of science, art, and intuition go into being a weatherman? What percentages of each of those?
You begin with a love. Nobody goes into meteorology because you pick it out of a hat in a career day. You do it because you've got a love. There's a passion for it. So that makes up, and that constitutes the drive to go through the system to come out with a degree, and then to go into the field. There's a love. And that's the beautiful part of it, is there's a passion with it. So I started with it as a love, but I didn't realize the presentation part of it. That's the art, the being able to speak to people, to communicate, to tell a story day after day after day, and make it interesting and engage people and make it about them. That's the art part of it. And if you know your story, you know the weather, you understand your location, and the longer you've been in a spot, the easier it is to get in a groove. In broadcasting, at least in the TV aspect of it, you've got to climb markets if you want to get a raise. My first job in Idaho Falls was $3.35 an hour. Then I went to college. My next job was $5 an hour in Topeka, but only for 2 hours a day. So I had to buy a car to drive to work. And that cost me more than the income I was getting. And thank goodness for student loans at that point in time. That Pell Grant was a glorious thing to get you through school.
That was amazing, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. And then that job, when I got the main job in Topeka, it was $15,000 a year. And
wow.
The next job was Omaha, and that went to $25,000 a year. So that was worth the raise. The problem was the first paycheck bounced. Like, oh crap! And that
seriously,
seriously, and so did the second.
Why was that?
It was a startup. But they gave me such great experience, and they exist to this day. It was RFD TV, Rural Free Delivery. But this was 1980, 88, 89. And what they didn't have, they were the big C-band antennas, satellite antennas that farmers had in the backyard. This was before the days of Dish Network and DirecTV.
Right.
They couldn't prove their audience. So they couldn't go to advertisers and say, hey, we're reaching 20,000, 40,000, 50,000 people. This demographic, they could not do that. So that was the big hole in their boat of their business model. They thought because they were rich Omaha cattlemen that they could throw this service up. And they, in the beginning, spared no expense until they had no money. And then things got dicey. They came back, they recapitalized, and they pushed forward, and they're on the air to this day. But it was those were early days were a bit hairy, and that was good experience for agriculture. I was forecasting nationally, and you're dealing with orange juice futures, you're dealing with oil pipeline capacities, with a cold front coming, an Arctic air blast, and gas companies need to get the product on the pipelines to get it to market in Milwaukee or Peoria or St. Louis. So there's a lot of dynamics in the commodity space that weather impacts every single day, and that was a really good education for me to be there and to see that part of it.
Well, I know that weather impacts everybody every day, and without a doubt, I mean, you could meet 5 new people today, and you're going to talk about weather with at least 4 of them. And why is that? Why do we talk about weather so much when, it's, you have avid Weather Channel watchers, but, sooner or later, most every person's going to talk about the weather. I mean, it's that big of a thing. It's
the common denominator. Day after day is, the weather, look at that. You pump of gas, the guy pulls up next to you. Hey, what a great day. It's an icebreaker. And, and that way it's a very easy topic to talk about. The sports guy at the end of the table, you got to be a sports fan if you want to have a conversation with that crowd. And if it's news, then that's a little more polarized these days than it used to be. But, news is news. You can talk about world events. But weather is the one easy topic that you can get into, unless you happen to point in the sky and say, hey, look at all those trails up there. What about that? What's going on? And then you're opening a topic that you may or may not want to go down with somebody.
And you don't have to be very scientific to look up and say, hey, it's sunny.
No, you don't.
And you can sound smart by talking about the weather.
Yeah, it's true.
And you don't have to know much. So Hurricane Laura, why did this hurricane change so quickly, and why would this be unexpected?
Almost all of them over the last, say, half dozen years have gone from category 1s to category a fat 3 or a very potent 4 in the 2 days before landfall. They've all gone through rapid intensification. And I wouldn't be lying if some of the guys I follow on Twitter aren't curious why this is so. The conditions they're favorable for developing, but why such rapid, such incredible, such intense development? How and why does that happen so often? And that is something that those are open questions. They don't have answers for. There's a lot of things they don't have answers for. And I believe when we begin to understand that there has been a political agenda to get a hold of this weather beast after World War II, that it became a national priority, then they'll go, oh, maybe this is some of what we're seeing. Maybe this is why this happened, or that storm did this, that there's an agenda behind these weather events. And disaster economics. It's a subject we're studying. when you've got an economy that's kind of on the edge, and that may not be relevant now, but when you break something, you have to build it. When you have a war, the economy booms after the war. They tore down Germany twice, and it's become a manufacturing juggernaut in the wake of these wars. You get to reset the entire system. And so once a hurricane comes through, and I spent 1.5 years in Puerto Rico after Maria, and you could begin to see how that rebuilding, how that storm was so necessary to clear out the dead wood of the system. The issue with Puerto Rico is that there's such a structure of corruption that's in place that it would take more than a hurricane to dislodge it. I talked to numerous FEMA guys after that, because we lived in a building and probably met 30 FEMA guys over the course of the time there, that they seriously didn't believe that the political structure of Puerto Rico could steal the billions, the tens of billions of dollars that was coming. But they managed to. They managed to steal enough of it that the people were impacted by that. So these storms have a way of bringing dollars to the local economy, the local politicians, the local construction, the local reconstruction. It's a process.
Historically speaking, just if we go back 150, 250 years, were hurricanes developing in the same pattern as they do now and sweeping across the Gulf? And did it look that way then? I mean, historically speaking, in the 1850s and 1900, were they dealing with hurricanes there?
Yes.
Like we do now? Okay.
Yes. And our records, honestly, are far sketchier.
Sure.
Covering that period of time, although there was certainly enough ship traffic that news of a hurricane would end up on land and it would get written up in some paper, logged in some book at some point in time. But it is the 19th or the 20th century when we began to, certainly once we had telegraph, that really helped, and then telephone helped even more. So we could get the stories out of the islands, and then communications back from ships that were out in the Atlantic or even the Pacific for that matter, to begin to generate this log. But our record is about 150 years. It is about 150 years. But once we got satellite record, that gives us much more accurate estimations. And they are still just estimations because we don't have direct measurements, estimations of storm intensity. Now with Laura, we had aircraft, of course, flying back and forth through these storms. And it was up at about 10,000 feet where the wind speeds were clocked at 150 miles an hour. Not on the ground. So this is a big difference between the storms that are happening now versus 50, 100 years ago, is that we're extrapolating down these wind speeds to the surface and without direct measurement that they didn't have back then. So it's very possible that Laura may have been registered at 120 or 130, not the 150 that is going to go in the record books, meaning that we're stacking the record books with recent storms because we're using different quantifying measurements. We're using a whole different science to measure the wind speeds. So it's one set of books for the new stuff and one set of books for the older storms. So it's kind of like what we've done with temperatures. We've completely rewired the sensor networks across the country. We're using electronic sensors, curiously, though not in Death Valley right now. They were installed and then deinstalled and put in the old boxes, even though the electronic ones are perfectly fine and it would homogenize the network. So there are hanky things going on in weather, in climate. There are things that really should raise one's eyebrows across a lot of subjects, really across a lot of subjects. And it's unfortunate because it's just the weather, guys. It's just the weather. If you can't trust the weather, if you can't trust your weatherman, then who do you trust? Who do you trust?
I'll ask you a political question because you were there in Puerto Rico. What happened? I mean, why did that look so different? Why was aid delayed so much, and why did it not get delivered to those who needed it the most, and to some places they didn't get aid at all. What happened there politically?
Yeah, there are three things with that. Number one, there was a storm that had just gone through 10 days prior, and that exhausted the supplies that were ready to be delivered. So they had already had one hurricane through. They already had power lines down. They already had the water bottles delivered. They already had paper towels distributed, if you want to say. And so those early supplies were exhausted and hadn't been pre-staged for the next event, which was less than 10 days later. The other thing is so many supplies did arrive, but they were warehoused by the corrupt local government. Warehoused. And they were warehoused for a couple of reasons, simply because people are greedy. The guy that put them in his warehouse, there was one in Ponce that they discovered after the earthquake that happened in January. They were there for Maria almost 2 years prior, a year and a half prior. They're still sitting in the warehouse, and he wasn't going to tell anybody that they were there because he was scoring almost $10,000 a month from the government for supplying and holding onto these warehouses, even though as people broke in, knowing that there were some supplies there, that they had been gone through, some of the wind-up batteries, some of the water bottles had been used. The people in the know were using that huge warehouse of supplies as their own stockpile. So many supplies were delivered, they just weren't made available to the citizens. And that brought down one governor, Ricky Rosario, in July of last year. He was marched out of office. Then his attorney general, still one of the two political parties, took over the governorship. But then she, papers and things came to light about her term as attorney general, where she refused to prosecute numerous episodes of known corruption because she didn't want to have to deal with the blowback from those people. It's a small island. It's a small, small island. It's 60 miles wide, 90 miles long. Maybe it's even in some spots only about 45 miles wide. So it's not a big island, but you've got nearly 3.5 million people there. But it's the same families over and over and over. One family, once THC CBDs became legal, boom, they let a realtor know that they needed 60 spots. They bought up the licenses and set up ownership of all of the weed shops. One family owns all the Wendy's on the island. So it's that kind of I'll pat your back if you pat my back kind of thing. So the island really needs the Department of Justice and the FBI to come back down there, and probably not an office from Miami or from DC or from New Orleans, but one from Seattle or Portland or someplace, Salt Lake City, someplace where there isn't a lot of connection to people that have influence down there. They've got to come in and clean it up. And Puerto Rico's not alone. Puerto Rico's not alone. Corruption is deep and wide across the island. Even FEMA money, 70% of it went to administrative costs for residential housing. 70% of that soaked up by the government rather than getting to the people. So this is why there's still blue tarps on homes down there. The money was sent. It just didn't get to the people, and it was out of FEMA's hand how it was sent. They had to write the check to the government of Puerto Rico rather than being able to, as they do stateside, distribute it to a school district and then audit it, to a hospital and then have the ability to audit, or to the aquifer system, which is leaking like a sieve, so they can dredge out the reservoirs that had so much sediment come in. So the island has the ability to prepare or plan for droughts, because droughts happen fairly regularly in the Caribbean. So I enjoyed my time there. The people are amazing. They're just living under a very expensive tax of corruption. It's a very expensive tax that doesn't need to be paid.
2 nights ago, I had a podcast, and it's going to be airing soon. But I was speaking with an alchemist, and we were talking about somatics, and you mentioned somatics, which is extremely interesting, known to vibrations known to create minimum and maximum displacements in things like particles and paste and liquids. So I would imagine these types of patterns could also appear in the atmosphere as well.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. That is wow. That's how I began this. There was a man by the name of Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Bearden, and he was in Army intelligence, nuclear physicist. It was his website that I came across, in 99, 2000, 2001, somewhere across that era where I was researching what is termed today grossly free energy. How do we pull energy from the vacuum? For goodness sakes, we live on a massive planet with a magnetic field that's spinning. There's got to be some electrical current that we can tap. It only makes sense. Nikola Tesla did it 100 years ago, so why can't we do that today and end, this age of dependence on petroleum? That is again another tax on humanity that doesn't need to exist. So that was what I was, researching when I came across some photographs of Lieutenant Colonel Bearden's that his webmaster posted about unusual altocumulus cloud patterns. And I'm looking at him like, whoa, well, look at that. That is a perfect square pattern or a cloud field that just had this incredible resonance in it. So I bought a cheap $100 little Olympus D360, I think is what it was, a 1.3 megapixel camera back in the beginning days. And I just started framing the sky. I started taking pictures. And once you start looking, you can't help but see. It's just, cause and effect. And if there's something there, then you're going to begin to recognize the pattern. And it began to show itself in everything. And it just it kind of led down a rabbit hole that ultimately I was willing to go down and research. And I wanted to discover, whether it was just BS or if it was legitimate. And I had to sit with it for 3 years before I didn't have to convince myself. The experience convinced myself, but I didn't let go of it. I was kind of like a honey badger. I'm going to find this thing out. And at the same time, 9/11 had happened. And so my trust grew to distrust of a lot of different things. And that led me down additional rabbit holes, and I could see where, and the power of weather manipulation, either in single events, means of assassination, means of international terrorism or financial terrorism, how you could choke out a country as small as North Korea, how you could down airplanes with wind shear, how a lightning strike at the most inopportune time in a very exact location can cause an interruption in a power supply. So you create an opening. There's a lot of opportunities with this technology when it's at your hands. So it was truly the desire for free energy that brought me into this, because that was probably the biggest hurdle I had to cross or express to people of where does the power come from to manage the weather. And it isn't done with thermodynamics. It's done with either resonance or electricity. And if we live on a planet that is a big old spinning battery, then that power exists. It's how do you harness it? How do you direct it? How do you use those interference patterns to create a kymatics kind of a pattern to get the end result that you're after? So there was a lot of learning I had to do myself. And there was a smaller crowd out there in 2003 and 2004 than there is now. The whole concept of geoengineering has grown greatly in the last 20 years, greatly. And social media has been partly responsible for that. And another is just the evolvement of mankind and our science quotient, our science IQ has climbed a little bit. And then we've had other whistleblowers. And that's always been a benefit. Always a benefit.
So what do you think the mechanism is? How is this happening?
I think HARP has a little bit to do with that. I interviewed, why does I have his name? I can see his face. I interviewed him, Bernard Eastland, in St. Louis back in November of 2007. He died a month later. That was a little scary / curious about HARP. He was more interested in what we were doing in studying dust devils and how pH can assist their actual rotational direction. He was very curious about that and how it would apply on Mars. I'm like, oh, okay. HARP has a part of it with
So
ionization.
explain HARP just for those who don't know what HARP is.
You should get Nick Begich on for that. I can just see the effects of these holes showing up in the clouds. Boom, hole opens up. On the backside of it, you got a rain shaft, and then there's this updraft. I was so driven to this, Cameron, that I bought 4 cameras, 2 computers, and time-lapse software to figure this thing out. I had a responsibility to my audience to figure out what was happening in the sky. And this was the beginning of 05. I was driven to figure this out. So I'd have the cameras on timers. They'd turn on at sunrise, turn off at sunset. I'd come home from doing the late news and then render the videos and watch. And just watch. I thought there's got to be something that these clouds are doing, some power that's introduced in there that I can see the introduction of. I can see, boom, there it is. There it shows up. And then what it does to the clouds, because I needed an edge. I didn't like being wrong. I don't like having to get on the news the next day and say, that one was busted. I was really, really good at forecasting. I was so good, it would really annoy the main guy when I was working in Tulsa. I would come in, rework his forecast the next morning, and he would get a little PO'd. And so he had the weekend guy, write all the forecast down to essentially verify our numbers. And I was whipping his butt. So I never heard about it from him. Never heard about it. It was only from the executive producer that told me. But I needed an edge against this technology. But they'll introduce waves. And these waves will course through the atmosphere. They'll just show up, and they're described as gravity waves, and maybe that's exactly what they are. I haven't been briefed on them to know, but I can see them. And as they push across the landscape, if you will, then a wave from another direction will come along. Maybe it's of a shorter wavelength, maybe it's taller. But when they intersect, you'll see the clouds interact. And now we're back to kinematics. Now we can see whether we end up with tall peaking, whether the waves create this interaction and they crest, and then they crash back down. And in that location where they intersect and crash up, then you can get towering cumulus. And if the pattern works long enough, eventually you'll get lightning, and eventually you'll get a little bit of rain. But now we have an atmosphere so doped up with these fine metal particles, with a little bit of aluminum, with a little bit of titanium, with a little bit of this and that, and ionizable salts. And this allows these technologies to hold on to the molecules, to hold on to water. And then that allows them a grip like snow tires inside of snow. Otherwise, you're just kind of slip sliding away. But this metal doping up of the atmosphere allows this technology just a greater effectiveness. And then the trails also let them know whether they were successful or less successful in their manipulation. It's I kind of wish I could share pictures with you, because that'd be super cool. And then I could talk you through some of this. But it's just something that I didn't have a mentor for. I had to study it and photograph and learn and watch and share with others and maybe inspire. And then they could go out and set up their cameras and time lapse. I mean, everybody with an iPhone or an Android phone can now time lapse. These apps are free. Set it up on a tripod and just time lapse the thing. And if you time lapse a day full of trails, then you're going to catch something. And watch how these planes interact with the trails that are already in the sky. Notice exactly the angles they cross the previous trails, where, what behaviors are happening in the trails that have previously been laid down. Is it where a trail is smeared, where it is gapped open? Does the secondary crossing plane cut it right at the end of an existing trail, and time lapse it, and then you begin to see why they fly where they fly. And these poor pilots, you think you go to flight school so you can fly these planes. Not anymore. Honeywell does it all. Honeywell, you get in, you plug in your destination, boom, the planes essentially do it all by themselves. And it's the Honeywell flight management system with the Honeywell spacecraft. It's Honeywell. They're the big boys, and they've got their base just outside of Colorado Springs. Schriever Air Force Base, it's right there. That's one of the nexus centers for this. So Yeah. I don't know what it's going to take to shut it down. Is it the government's going to have to go broke? We're going to have an earthquake at some of these data centers. I don't know. I don't know how it's going to end. I don't know. But one thing we do know is that the climate's changing. And how can I say this? We don't have a baseline for what the planet's weather/climate systems would be doing absent this interference, absent this modification. If we were to take away the modification, what would happen to weather and the climate? What would be going on? And that's an unknown that I would like to know. I would like to know. Because if you add these clouds, ultimately, there's going to be some impact in the day-to-day temperature. If you're suppressing thunderstorms, then that means the ground isn't getting rain. That means it's drier. That means it's cooler at night, warmer in day. There's all kinds of variables that are being muddied, clouded up because of this action. So one of these days we'll get the answers.
And I know there's other ways of controlling the weather. This is an interesting thing that I saw back in 2005. I was going to Canada to see the Calgary Stampede, and I could see that there was a bad thunderstorm coming from the east, and I thought, wow, this is going to mess things up because it's, there's 1 million people in town that day. And so right in front of us, the whole thing developed. By the time we got to where the storm was, it was over and done. And in some parts, it had left 2 feet of hail. And in other parts, in the underpasses, there was 4 feet of water and cars stuck there. And it was probably a band of maybe a mile wide by a few miles long. But what I heard, what was reported in the paper the next day was the fact that they knew that this storm was coming, and being in that part of the world, its thunderstorms are not unusual in the late afternoon, and they did some cloud seeding to prevent or to make that storm develop quicker, and to try to steer it away from Calgary, basically. I mean, that was on the front page of the paper. Does that sound like something that you've ever heard of? I mean, I haven't heard of it since, and prior to that, I had never heard of it.
Yeah, with that intention, that's interesting that they were aware of the potential, and I think we all have that in the forecast. That's why cities like that will have meteorologists on staff so they could deal with flooding and that kind of advanced warning of, for them it'd be snow would be their biggest threat. The fact is that they went up and silver iodided it to bring it out. They triggered it. So right. It was apparently a young storm that was probably going up fairly violently, but not so quickly that they couldn't already get an aircraft up to try to seed it out. That's interesting. That's very interesting. It kind of blew my mind, and it was so severe. I never expected to run into it, and it happened so quickly that people were caught under underpasses. There was so much water, people were stuck in their cars, and they would get out of the car and wade through this icy water up to the chest with, 6 inches of hail on top of it. And, and that was just that band. And we took a right-hand turn and drove around all of it. I mean, it was as dry as could be everywhere else, it was that small,
and it was very small, but the impact was so dramatic. I'd never seen such a small area get hammered so bad in 20 minutes. I mean, it was incredible.
Yeah, that's intense. Well, because there's a lot of what's called CAPE, C-A-P-E, or convective available potential energy. So when those kind of storms pop, it's like you've got a balloon that continues to swell, and you prick a hole in it, and either the balloon shatters and then a lot of storms go up, or it goes up very localized, and then that energy is focused up that one updraft, up that one thunderstorm. So I would be curious in looking at that day to see what other thunderstorms popped, if any. And if it was just the one, then that makes sense that it was very localized. And maybe it was triggered. Maybe they wanted it to kind of break the cap and get the storm going so they could just alleviate the potential energy. in one form or another. And at Colorado Springs, here on the Front Range, they deal with hail so often. It's ridiculous. But they're at about 6,000 feet. I don't think Calgary is quite that high in elevation. So that would have been
I think they're like 3,400, 3,500 feet, something like that.
Yeah. But it was probably big hail, and there was a lot of insurance claims out of that storm.
Well, and the thing that's so incredible, the amount of precipitation that came out of that so fast. I've never seen that before, and I haven't seen it since. And then the other thing that made me think is, well, obviously they had some. Did they have a plan for this? I mean, obviously they knew a storm was coming, and they were able to get up in the air that quick, make things happen, or I don't know. I don't know how it worked. To me, it sounded like they shot these birds up in the air, and they did whatever they do, and moments later, all hell broke loose.
Boom, boom. Yeah, and it's not unique. There's got to be an energy. One thing that is not studied in meteorology is the electrical effects of the planet on the weather and climate. We know thunderstorms because they're massive columns of rotating air and eventually ice and ice crystals that they create a current because we see lightning. We see the sprites out of the tops of these thunderstorms connecting with the magnetosphere and then down and grounding out down to the ground. We see that electrical connection. It's just not studied amongst the rest of the process. Even from snow, with all of those crystals, we'll occasionally get a lightning and a snowstorm. So the whole electrical process is not one that garners a whole lot of funding or researchers or papers to be written about. It's still kind of this mystery area. And in 2020, I have to wonder why this hasn't been a huge area of research. I mean, with like a laser focus. And maybe it has been. It's just that the discoveries haven't been then shared with those that don't have classifications, that don't have clearance, that there are tools there in the electronics, in the electrical part of weather that some people have access to, but they just don't want us to understand that there's a lever to play with the weather through electricity. I have to admit that that's probably the case.
So who's doing it and why?
Who can afford it?
You kind of mentioned why, but who's doing it?
Yeah, I think the why would vary by the day unless there's a long-term agenda. If a regime change seems to be a really big one for the States, it's certainly been applied against Iran, it's been applied against Egypt, against Iraq, and probably presently against China right now with that flooding to take out the CCP. I would bet that's a weather op that's going on. The rains are so incredible. And I would not be surprised to see a little earthquake hit that Three Gorges Dam and see what happens. See how long that regime lasts after that kind of a massive natural catastrophe. And that's the beautiful thing about these weapons, is that they're always going to be insured as an act of God. A very expensive act of God, but ultimately insurance pays the bill. And then that lets you really get away with a lot of covert activities. A lot of covert activity. I mean, that was William Cohen, defense secretary under Bill Clinton, in '96, talking about eco-terrorism, and that, quote unquote, I'm going to booger it up, but that others are engaged in this kind of eco-terrorism and in the use of electromagnetic tools. So it happens. It's been studied for 100 plus years, and the Germans were probably very, very good at it. And we paperclipped a lot of their bright and brilliant minds over here, and that their work just went on, uninterrupted. So to what end really becomes, what's the political situation of the day, of the week, of the month, of the year? Will determine what kind of weapon gets deployed.
So you're thinking right now with China and flooding, it's retaliation.
Yeah, for the virus.
Right.
Yeah, it's absolutely retaliation for the virus. And China has spent so much of their gross domestic product on weaponry, and they've stolen so much intellectual property, so much. And they have, laser focus on what I see is eventually world domination. That would be their goal. And they could literally, if they were given like 4 more years, roll across the planet. Nobody would be able to stop them. Nobody. They've got nukes. They have the ability to build landing gear, amphibious landing, aircraft, space, anti-satellite technology. They've got it. They just needed additional time so they could. If I was gaming, I would probably roll into Vietnam, and with that would enable them to secure the South China Sea. Then the Philippines is next. Philippines already kicked out the United States, so China would take that base there, and then they would solidify the South China Sea. Next, they'd probably head to Australia. They've bought so much in the way of raw materials from Australia that they're a small, they're a sparsely populated continent. There's a lot of empty space, and so with a billion 4 people, a fat standing army, they could probably roll through Australia fairly quickly. And that is a long, long way away from the United States, that we couldn't support those kind of supply chains to help out the Aussies. We couldn't do it. We really couldn't do it. So China was on the verge of probably a big military exercise in the southeast part of Asia, and it wouldn't have gone well for the United States. So this was a way to cut them off at the knees. Just flood them out, send them a little famine, and then gut their manufacturing, and we'll just bring our manufacturing back best we can, and just kind of grit our teeth as the world adjusts to a new day without China being the center of attention.
So you think that COVID is a bioengineered weapon?
Oh, it's a given. Yeah, Luc Montagnier, who was the discoverer, first isolator of HIV back in '83. He's like, it was his testimony that this is an engineered virus, absolutely an engineered virus with HIV inserts, which was his discovery. And he's like, there it is sitting in this COVID thing. And we've got the solution to it. Hydroxychloroquine, erythromycin and zinc. It's done. And we can get back to work. We can take off these bloody, stupid masks, and we can, just continue on with lives. We've got the solution, but that it obviously didn't kill enough people yet. So we're still going masks, and there's a civil war is coming. And I dream that that neither of these two characters will be inaugurated. Not going to happen. Trump won't win, and even if he does win, the Democrats will try to invalidate the election best they can. And they've already been able to whip up Antifa and Black Lives Matter to as their little soldier boys. So whether it's social justice or not, it's a show. It's a show, and it's nothing more than a show right now. So I think there'll be a third party, a third person, somebody who can unite this country, someone who can speak to both sides. Ultimately, Antifa, BLM, and Make America Great all want the same thing. At the core, they want the same thing. And if we can demonstrate that, they'll recognize that we want big government, kind of pared back. We want an equal opportunity. We want the racism aspect to not be there to end. We want an opportunity. And if we could get rid of the Fed and the banking system and those royal families which have lorded over us for centuries, if not millennia, then I think humanity has a chance. And we do all want the same thing. And that's safety, security, and to be respected, and a way to make a proper and a fair living. It's not that much to ask for. We all want the same thing. We just have different ways of going at it. And there's so much vitriol in the media and against each other that even if you wrote down a list, both sides, both protesters, it was kind of silly what they were doing, spraying pepper spray on each other in Portland over the weekend. If they sat down on a sheet of paper and left Trump and politics out of it, they could write on the sheet and it'd all have the same things. They're like, yeah, we want that. We want this. We want this. We want this. We all just want the same things.
So let me ask you this. What about a naturally occurring virus? I mean, we're long overdue. There's been countless viruses for 200 years. And, You know, there's so many that we've kind of taken that for granted, and our ability to cope and jump on those in time. But this was a little different. The response was different. Everything was different.
Yeah,
but
because it was planned.
But I'm just saying there's got to be other naturally occurring viruses out there that could even be worse. What about viruses like Ebola and now measles? Is it's been in Africa. It's always been in Africa, but it just killed a lot of kids, and they seem to be able to jump on that one and control it.
At this point in time, we're going to have to deal with COVID one way or another. It's out there. It's loose. There's no control. And I think ultimately it'll be a chicken pox like situation where the kids have to get it. They got to get it young, and then they could process it, and then everybody just goes on about their lives. We've never quarantined the healthy. We've always quarantined the sick. That's the big difference. We quarantine the sick. We don't quarantine the healthy. And if we can't test and have accurate, rapid testing, tests that are actually accurate. It's interesting. There were like 77 NBA players that tested positive, but when they retested those same samples with a different lab, they were all negative. All negative. So there is an agenda with this virus. And with the gross domestic, the GDP of the nation in the second quarter down 31 point some odd percent, just last quarter, we've contracted a third of the economy. That's a huge, huge weight now on the debt that's in place nationally. There's no way we can service this debt. There's no way we will ever pay off all of this free money we've given away. We're setting ourselves up for a massive economic crash / reset. That's the way it is. And on the other side of this grand currency reset, I would like to see the government maybe spend $1 for every 5 they've previously spent. That there are so many departments that didn't exist 50 years that probably don't need to exist today. That we can shrink this beast back to something that's a little more digestible, something that respects us as human beings and citizens rather than servants of the state. This is an opportunity, Cameron. This is a huge, huge opportunity. And both Antifa and MAGA are going to take advantage of it. And if we could just bring them together and if we could have a discussion, I think we could get our way through this. We could take our way through this. And then this country, wouldn't have to be torn down. And we go back to there is no 46th president, that Trump is the last one, and we have to have another George Washington, and we begin again. That's the road we're on. That's the road we're on.
We haven't gone from pandemic to endemic. This is
going
to go away?
I don't think it's going to go away ever. I mean, if we're treating it the way we're treating it, no, it can't go away because we're isolating people so they don't get sick, rather than giving them the tools to get sick and get through it. We've got to deal with it and just kind of ride the wave. We've got to ride the wave. We've got the tools to ride through this. There will be a death toll. That's a given, but it will be much, much higher if we keep doing it the way we've been doing it.
I don't think we have the patience for natural selection at this point in our development of our planet. I mean, we can't wait 30,000 years.
No, we can't, and the planet will not wait either.
No.
I don't want to say karma won't wait either. It has its own time schedule.
You bet.
And China's got a bit of karma coming to it. It's going to be painful. It's going to be painful. And we will have a lot of parts and supply lines that are disrupted, a lot of companies where they're just one of a kind sitting in that, and then we could lose 100, 150 million people very, very quickly in 40 hours. In 40 hours, when that dam breaks, and then everything's changed. We'll probably respond to Taiwan, and we'll be their buddy, and have a base sitting right off of China. It's going to be interesting. That's all I can say, Cameron. It's going to be news is going to. If we thought 2020 was crazy up till now, the last third is going to be ridiculous. Ridiculous.
So who invented weather as a weapon in World War II?
It was probably by committee. And the Germans were probably first. I don't know if we were smart enough to figure that out. I know Tesla had talked about it, that it was doable. He probably even demonstrated it to some near him. But if I had to put a name on it, I would probably say Tesla.
There's so many conspiracies, though, about all this technology that the Germans had, yet a lot of those theories we've never seen in fruition.
Yep.
But then again, we took most of their scientists and they became our scientists. So what happened to those super weapons that they supposedly created?
Well, they probably got absorbed into our system. Absorbed, used, re-engineered. What was it? The British guy, McKinney, who hacked NASA and talked about our off-world navy and non-human commissioned sailors of our off-world navy. So that's probably where the technology and a lot of money has gone, is into this shadow government, this shadow agenda, the relationships with other races, intelligences, planets, so forth and so on out there. It's crazy what we don't know about our own planet and our own government's abilities and capabilities, and maybe it is even our government now. But it's all been corporatized, and now we're back to the fascism aspect of it that we'd all like to get to see kind of rectified here as soon as possible. So we're all marching for us to get better.
One more thing. Do you think there's disinformation specialists out there that further muddy the waters and make it really hard to determine what in the hell is actually going on?
If they're not out there, then that's a huge, huge failure of an intelligence operation. A huge failure. You've got to have disinformation out there. You throw out 10% truth with 90% BS, and then a few will catch it, but it's wrapped up in so much other stuff that it becomes very easy to dismiss if you come across 2, 3, 4 data points that don't match with the one bit of truth. And this was a test I went through as I was weeding through all of these different ways of thinking, is that the truth is like a TV screen, a lot of pixels, and each pixel has its own value. It has its own brightness, has its own color, has its own duration. And that's what reality is like. It's all a bunch of pixels, and they're ever morphing and changing and exchanging data between the adjoining pixel. And I couldn't say that this one is bad, this one is wrong, because I didn't have the context for what surrounds it. And if you don't throw data away that you don't understand, but just hold on to it in time, it will be accepted, or then you can definitively say, no, this does not fit. This is BS. This doesn't fit this part of the story. However, over here, I can see that thread as to why they would throw that piece of information from that narrative over with this one. It's just spaghetti. You got to follow the right noodle across and through the entire journey of the plate of spaghetti. And sometimes they're red.
And sometimes they are. Scott Stevens has been inside the guest studio. Thanks so much. It's nice to meet you.
My pleasure, Cameron. My pleasure.
Yeah, I think we got one more of these in us sometime. Very, very interesting, and my mind is always open.
Mine too.
To new possibilities. So
yeah, because life is eternal, and the potential realities that we could find ourselves in are just as large. So to think this is all there is really selling yourself hugely short.
Just mention a little bit for a second about you do a lot of Facebook Lives. What are we seeing there, and how often do you do that?
I ended up with kind of a group of people who, my second love outside of science is economics, and we kind of clicked with economics, and we decided it was just time in this new COVID world to start a little company, and it's called Metadime Digital. So we've got a blog there. I do lives what is that, 7 times a week. So 5 for weather, Monday through Friday at 5 o'clock Mountain. And then on Monday and Wednesday, I do a little more talk showy where I can talk about some other things outside of weather, although with my wheelhouse, I can always bring it back to weather to make it fit everybody. And I call that another perspective. So we'll look at, accountability. We've talked about time travel. We All Want the Same Thing was one of the shows I did about a month ago. They're just some of the things that I would not have been able to do a show on when I was in television. It's a big wide world out there, and social media and these venues and these tech giants have allowed us a little bit of a pipeline to get out to the people and to reach an audience that we wouldn't have been able to with either just a website or just being on the air with a commercial station. So the internet revolution has just been kind of really, really cool, and let's leverage it.
Let's do it. Hey, thanks very much, man, and you take good care of yourself and stay safe. Talk to you soon.
We'll do it again.
Thank you, Scott.
You betcha.